I thought when playing originally that Nyx would have been sort of like something I'd use occasionally, and thinking maybe I might be using more of the stealth takedowns and stuff. But it became pretty integral to the gameplay. It's really cool because you're kind of always like looking at the angles and seeing, well, okay, what can I do over here? How can I cause a distraction? Do I want to set an explosion off over there to draw attention over there, or do I want to use that explosive barrel to blow up a few enemies? So, there's quite an interesting variety in the way that you can approach each particular area as well, which I found really fun. And yeah, and when it breaks bad, you're just like, all right, here we go. Star Wars time.
SIFTER.com.au.
G'day, I'm Chris Button, and this is Drop Rate, SIFTER's video game review podcast. Let's return to a galaxy far, far away with Ubisoft's take on the Star Wars universe. Will it make the Kessel Run, or fall into a Sarlacc pit? That's right, we are playing Star Wars Outlaws. Now, joining me today is Gianni, SIFTER's executive producer and resident Star Wars tragic. So, who better to chat with about Star Wars Outlaws? So, to kick things off, what is Outlaws? Where does this fit within the very broad, very wide Star Wars lexicon at this point?
Yeah, Star Wars Outlaws is a open world Ubisoft game. If you've played one of those in the past, imagine that, and then put some Star Wars flavor across the top. But what it is a really nice take on the Star Wars universe. It's a really interesting, immersive experience. It feels like it fits within the canon of everything else that's happening really nicely. And it also doesn't fall into as many of the traps that those sort of Ubisoft list-ticking games tend to have. And it's really quite an enjoyable experience, that one that I think both open world fans and Star Wars fans will get a lot out of.
Yeah, this does feel like, and when I say a narrower focus, that's not to say it's a narrow game, because this is still an open world adventure. So there's still lots to see, lots to do, and plenty of areas to explore. But I totally agree that in comparison to, say, some of the, even like the Far Cry franchise or the Assassin's Creed games and that sort of thing, this does feel narrower and more focused in scope. And I think part of that is even the way that the game is framed, even from the camera. It defaults to you in the 21:9 filmic aspect ratio, which does frame things more tightly, and it almost lends itself to the focus for the game ahead, because a lot of your time isn't necessarily spent in these wide open and expansive areas. It's spent in these very densely populated, sort of shady underworld, often forgotten places of the Star Wars universe, in some of these areas that we haven't really got to explore in a lot of other sort of, I suppose, examples in the Star Wars franchise. Because
it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've been playing Star Wars games since the 90s, and I've played heaps and heaps and heaps of them. And this is very genuinely one of the first ones I felt like actually it feels like you're in Star Wars. It actually, the worlds and the cities that you visit feel like stuff is going on, and that people are kind of milling around, but they're not just kind of like set dressing. They're actually doing bits and pieces, and it's really interesting the way that it's kind of set together. And I think that's right. When you think about Star Wars Outlaws, there's kind of like a really wide areas. There's wide areas, big open expanses, which is like the expanse of the Star Wars world, and then there's also those really tight spaces as well. When you're moving through cities, or you're moving through Imperial bases, or crawling through tunnels and everything like that. And I think what it does really nicely is it captures a lot of the key elements of what makes Star Wars really fun, right? So there's a bit of intrigue, there's a bit of plotting, there's all of that sort of stuff. There is, the hero goes in with a good plan and tries their best, but when it breaks bad, they have to fight their way out gunslinging, and that is all part of it as well, which is really, really cool. And and also, like, one of the best Star Wars dogfighting games I've played in a really long time. Just fighting in space in a spaceship is really, really satisfying. So, I think it makes a really compelling case for this sort of Star Wars game. And I'm wondering if it's just now that we've reached the point where technology and the devices that we're playing on are powerful enough that we can actually fully realize what that world is like. Even for me, I found like, as someone who's played so many of them, even the recent Star Wars Jedi Survivor and all of those sorts of games, like the worlds felt empty basically, the only people in the world were people you were basically lightsabering effectively. And this isn't that at all. It's actually much more teeming with life, and the places feel so much more fascinating and interesting to experience. And there's so many moments where, you just basically feel like you've walked into a location on one of the Star Wars films. The original first two locations we didn't explore too much in the Star Wars films, but I've made it to Tatooine, and I'm just walking into places and seeing things that were in the movies, and I'm like, holy moly, this is exactly what I imagined it to be. And you just walk in and it's so cool. So, I think it's done a really magical thing about capturing some of that experience. But Chris, I'm really curious for you. Like, I tried my best to try and stealth my way through, but quite often I just, mucked it up, ruined the sight lines or whatever in my stealthy moments, and then had to go blasting my way out. What was your experience like?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I think to take things one step sort of back a little bit, because a lot of the Star Wars games do delve into sort of this hero worship and power fantasies of Jedi and that sort of stuff. But the person you're playing as, Kay Vess, there's this brand new character in the Star Wars universe. She is not an all-powerful being capable of taking down armies by herself. She's just a scrappy scoundrel who is trying her best to survive in an underworld that is very unforgiving. So the gameplay really reflects that, and hence why there is this focus on stealth, is because she's really only dealing with the weapons she has at her disposal, which is a one-handed blaster, maybe some grenades, and her fluffy axolotl-like friend Nix, who I could spend an entire podcast talking on about himself just in isolation. But a lot of it is stealth in terms of this part of the game is something that is very familiar if you've played a lot of AAA and open world games, particularly from Ubisoft before, because a lot of it is you're thrown into a new sort of area. You've got to do a little bit of scouting, try and figure out the patrols of the stormtroopers or whichever criminal syndicate's area you're trying to sort of infiltrate, and identify where they are, where there are opportunities to sabotage or cause distractions, or perhaps get some of them caught up in explosive barrels, which this wouldn't be a video game if there weren't very brightly red telegraphed explosive barrels.
Conveniently placed.
Yes, very conveniently placed, as is the very conveniently hip height placed objects for you to take cover behind everywhere. But it's really interesting because I like the way they've structured a lot of the levels and areas for you to explore, because some of it feels a little bit perhaps not quite to the same level of Dishonored and Deus Ex for some reference points, but I do really like the way that there is no single path to success, or there's no single path to your objective. The levels are designed cleverly in a way that you can go a few different ways. You can climb through vents, you can sneak around, or you can take a more direct path, or there's all manner of things that you can try. But I found it was really enjoyable and really satisfying finding your way through each of these encounters, and they weren't overly telegraphed, which made you feel like that, okay, I made this discovery, or I made this my way, as opposed to the video game too heavy-handedly saying, no, this is the only way you can go. So I did find that really satisfying. But as you say, Gianni, you found yourself in plenty of firefights, as did I. What did you make of this mix of the stealth and the firefights and the general gameplay mix of Outlaws?
Well, I mean, to say that Nix has got no superpowers is kind of like a bit of because Nix is your superpower effectively.
Yeah.
Basically, you've got the sort of like Assassin's Creed detection mode with Nix's antenna thing, so you kind of get a bit of that look through walls sort of mode. You can affect things in the space, as you said, send Nix off to go set off a trap or open a door, so you can just dart through and slide on. And I think it's really good the way that balance of that combat and stealth kind of works nicely. And just like you said, so many times I'd be working my way through a space and then I go, oh, wow, there's another path that I could have gone completely the other way. And, as you kind of just do the thing that you do in video games where you just kind of look around every corner and go down ways that you don't need to go, just to try and see if you can find any secrets and things like that. It was really cleverly put together in that particular way. So, I loved getting into fights. I actually really enjoyed it. I tried my best to avoid it as much as possible, but There are certain moments where you just kind of have to. And it is about being strategic, and it is about using the weapon that you have at hand, which has got multiple different modes. It's got a normal attack mode. It's got a sort of stun or like an ion mode, which takes out robots. And it's also got like almost like a rocket launcher mode that you can unlock later in the game as well. So it's about using those particular different skill sets that you've got, but you've got to stay out of fire because you just take damage and you've lost all your health really, really quickly. The good thing is if you're kind of behind fire and you've taken about a few enemies and they've dropped a little health pack, a back to vial on the ground, you can send Nix off while you're covering, hiding behind a bit of thing as you do that and grab some more health and bring it back to you, which is really cool. But there is that. I thought when playing originally that Nix would have been sort of like something I'd use occasionally, and thinking maybe I might be using more of the stealth takedowns and stuff. But it became pretty integral to the gameplay in a way which I thought was really handy. And you can be more specific with how you actually issue commands. You can hold down the L1 button for me on the PlayStation and actually direct paths, and you might want to set up little distraction traps so you can get the enemy's attention off in a different direction. Or quite often there's like a contextual little Nix marker that appears across an enemy or across a door frame, door switch or a security panel or any of these sorts of things. And you can just tap L1 and then Nix will go and do it. So, it's really cool because you're kind of always like looking at the angles and seeing, well, okay, what can I do over here? How can I cause a distraction? Do I want to set an explosion off over there to draw attention over there? Or do I want to use that explosive barrel to blow up a few enemies? So, there's quite an interesting variety in the way that you can approach each particular area as well, which I found really fun. And yeah, and when it breaks bad, you're just like, all right, here we go. Star Wars time.
And I think that's such a great point about Nix, because I think looking at the game or looking at any of the promotional materials, I think it would be very easy to be skeptical and cynical and think, oh, well, this cute little Nix side character is, just a part of the marketing push to add, the cutesy little companion. But the reality is, yes, he is very cute, very charming, and a wonderful foil to the story. But he is such an integral part of the gameplay loop. And as you say, being mapped to the shoulder button is very easy to use in these encounters, whether it be during stealth or combat moments. He does form such a great sort of addition to the gameplay layer. And yeah, as you say, he is not someone to be used sparingly. He is such a well baked in element of sort of how K controls and maneuvers and interacts with the world, which I think is really cool and a lot of fun to play around with. But a lot of this gameplay loop does repeat itself throughout the game, and I actually found with the firefights, I thought early on, yep, these are okay. They feel punchy, and you feel the impact of blasters hitting stormtroopers, or in turn getting hit by blaster fire. But I felt early on it did feel a little bit one note. But when you start getting some of those upgrades, or when you defeat some of the enemies, you can actually pick up their weapons and use them only temporarily, because Kay, she only keeps her own blaster with her permanently. But there's some decent and surprising variety with these weapons and the way that these abilities work, in terms of some of them are almost like blaster shotgun type of things. You even find some grenade launchers, and there's some really heavy weaponry that makes these combat encounters feel even more punchy than some of these early game scenarios. And I was really surprised and pleasantly surprised by how well these encounters actually developed over time. And I was wondering if you felt the same, or had any other observations about how it sort of increased the further you went in the game.
Yeah, I think it's easy to kind of fall into a trap where you just want to use your main gun all the time, and switching between the modes. But I think that, as you said, you're reminded, and there's big prompts that pop up all over the game as they are in there, to go and get Nix to go and grab you a different weapon and sort of just mix up the combination of things that you've got, get to a slightly different position, use your grenade launcher to try and clear a little bit of space and take out some other bits and pieces. So I think it's one of those things for it does take a little bit of time. I don't know about you, but like I didn't always remember that I could go and grab an extra gun. But then I remembered, it usually when I had a bit of extra space or thinking in that moment, same as when, I've got surrounded by enemies and you can actually just like send Nix off to go and harass one of them just to get them off you for a second so you can kind of concentrate on taking one down. I quite often forgot that I could do that. But then when I was like, I should be doing this all the time, I got to try and keep moving all those bits and pieces around. So, it's quite surprising, the variety of the combat, but it's one that I kept enjoying every time. And what I also find is like kind of wild in terms of like you're supposed to be doing all these contracts for different outlaw crews, basically all the different criminal syndicates, and they're like, whatever, just blow up a bunch of our dudes, that's fine. It's no big deal. You can still do jobs for them. Like you just head back to the cantina. They're like, well, we're not very happy with you, but we need you to go and do this thing. And it's like, okay, cool. It's consequence-free world effectively. So did you find that contrast a bit funny?
I did. There are a couple of points there that I find particularly interesting. And when I played the preview of this game a few weeks ago, I was actually a bit taken aback by how violent the game was in terms of all the Star Wars games or the Star Wars properties that I've come across. The body count in this game is obscene in terms of the amount of people that you kill or knock out and that sort of thing. Like in true Star Wars fashion, it's not bloody. You're not decapitating people like, say, I'm trying to remember the name of the game, the Star Wars Jedi Knight Academy games, where you could literally maim stormtroopers and lop their limbs off and that sort of thing. And then, of course, there was the Star Wars The Force Unleashed games, which, playing as a Sith lightning-equipped character, you'd take down quite a few people. But Kay is not backward in coming forward in terms of if something's in her way, she'll take them down, whether lethally or non-lethally. So, which does present some funny, I'm not sure if you call them contradictions or I think the fact of the matter is because Outlaws does focus on these criminal syndicates that you're doing contracts for and trying to play off one another, contradictions is sort of the name of the game because of the nature of the underworld, yesterday's enemy is today or tomorrow's friend because it's all about who is more advantageous to you at any given moment or who can you take advantage of next and that sort of thing. So it does tonally at times it's a little bit jarring to you say, I'm going to really piss off Crimson Dawn by blowing something up or stealing something incredibly valuable to them for the sake of pleasing the Hutts. And then the next day, there are some consequences because if you annoy a syndicate enough, then they will act like shoot to kill when they see you. But then after a while, they'll be like, well, if you do this really important job for us, we'll give you more work or that sort of thing, which it does feel a bit weird at times, but I sort of get it because when you're living in the criminal underworld, you can't really afford to be choosy about who you work with. So, yeah, I don't know if you felt the same or whether there was anything different that you sort of observed with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like I know that the whole tension of this game is basically those different sliders that you're basically the four main cartels that are in there. Effectively, you're trying to play off against each of those to try and to get advantage, and they've got different gear and all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of like a rep system. It moves pretty handily between the two. But there's some quests that you can do that are like directly opposing one of the other cartels, and it has no consequence. So I was like, oh, cool. I can go and drop a listening bug in the middle of the Crimson Dawn base, and the Ashiga will be thrilled about it. I'll get some credits, but the Crimson Dawn don't care. So I could actually picture a world where effectively you could get all of the cartel rep to the max without having a massive choice between the two. So it's interesting. The choices that are presented to you throughout the game, especially when you're doing these sort of standard missions, not sort of story missions, the ones that are kind of like the bread and butter of exploring this world, you're quite often presented with a choice, right? You can either, do the job for the Ashiga clan and go, yeah, cool, we'll do them. But you might also, in fact, want to sell the information to the Hutts instead, and you kind of betray them. And you can get a bit of an extra rep. And those sort of ones have a consequence where you're kind of actually directly competing between the two. But some of them you could just complete and then you just get a bonus. So you're like, oh, cool, great, they love me, everyone loves me. So we're in a good place.
Yeah, I think my interpretation of that is that perhaps some of these jobs that say you do something for the Huts or the Crimson Dawn and they're really pleased about it, perhaps the in-game justification for that is, oh, you did so stealthily or so slyly that the other party isn't even aware that you're responsible for it. So
yeah,
that's my headcanon.
Quite often have a good rep with that crew. So I had quite a few where I just walked straight into the Crimson Dawn base and like, hey everyone, see you at Sabak later in the week or whatever. And I'm just gonna pop in here for a minute. Hope nobody worries. Yeah, don't worry. Just drop this thing in the middle of their base. All right, see you later. And then some of the guys go, yeah, she's fine. She's welcome here anytime. And so I walked out, which was so funny. So
yeah. I think that the reputation system, is an interesting one and does form a central part of Star Wars Outlaws. But I think ultimately it's a way of engaging with the world, but it doesn't super prevent or gate you from doing anything, because yes, there is the ability to gain favor with a particular syndicate, which means that you get discounts at their vendors, or they will offer you exclusive gear that you can't get anywhere else. But it's it's something that's there, and something I haven't necessarily engaged with super heavy. It's more, okay, the consequences of my actions are represented in XYZ fashion. Fine. But what I really like is that as well as the gear, you can equip gear that it doesn't necessarily increase, say, attack +5, defense +3, etc., which I like. It's more, it'll reduce your cooldowns between using your adrenaline shot, or it will give you a health boost whenever you do a stealth takedown, that sort of stuff. I really like that. Despite this being a Ubisoft game and a big AAA open world action adventure sort of game, it hasn't fallen too deeply into the trap of collect things, number goes up, number gets bigger, enemy numbers get bigger as well, yada yada yada. It feels reasonable and reasonably presented, that there are no complex skill trees here. There's still satisfying progression in terms of if you do perform various feats, like a particular style of takedown or using nicks in various ways, you'll get a little boost or an augment to some of your abilities, and it's done so in a way that encourages you to engage with the world and play slightly different ways to be able to get some of those augments or upgrades. But it's not really in your face and you must have gear level 10 or whatever to be able to take on this encounter. It doesn't arbitrarily gate you or prevent you from progressing, from missions or from progressing further in the story in the game, which I really appreciate.
It's interesting because for me, for lots of this game, it actually feels a lot like an Assassin's Creed game in many aspects, because of the stealth aspects, and you're kind of even hiding in tall grass and whistling to bring enemies into your attack range. You just knock them out and things like that. But you're right; those Assassin's Creed games kind of went into that really stat heavy, crazy mode, and you don't want to be like, oh, you're only level 20, you can't come to this level 35 enemy area because you'll be destroyed immediately. It doesn't feel that way, which I think is really cool, because you can just kind of follow what feels like your curiosity, which is a bit the same as when really open world expansive parts of this game feels sort of like inspired by a Breath of the Wild or a Tears of the Kingdom, for example. You just say, oh, that looks interesting, I'll go in that direction and have a look. And that's kind of really cool, and it's one of the biggest, I think, innovations that's come out from those games, is that now it's like, where does the player want to go? Well, let's put a bunch of interesting sight lines on the map for people to explore and go and visit. And that's the same as well. When you're flying around in your spaceship, quite often you're in the sort of orbit of a planet. That's where most of these sort of space environments kind of happen. But you're looking around and you're like, oh, cool, there's like a little marker that pops up. Okay, I can go over there, or that thing over there kind of looks interesting, but it's not marked at all. So I'm going to go towards that and see what happens, and you get little prompts and stuff as well. But Chris, we've got to talk about the space combat, because the space combat in this game is incredible. I really loved it.
I am not as keen on the space combat as you perhaps are, Gianni. I don't dislike it, but especially a little while ago there was Star Wars Squadrons, which was a game focused purely on dogfighting and space combat. So I think not necessarily a like for like comparison, but I. I didn't mind the space combat as something to sort of throw a bit of flavour, throw a bit of variety into the gameplay mix. But to me, it did feel a little bit slow, and I think this is by virtue of the ship that you fly is not necessarily a combat specific ship, so there's not the same responsiveness as killing the thrusters, turning on a dime, and then punching the thrusters again to really pull off some of those combat maneuvers. But I felt like it was fair. It was serviceable when it wasn't the thrill I get of playing Squadrons or the old Rogue Squadron games, taking down a Star Destroyer, for example. But
they're much more technical space shooters, though, I'd say. And this is an arcadey version. And I think for, capturing that feeling of, and it's relatively straightforward because, like, you just basically hold down the left trigger and then you lock onto an enemy and you just shoot a little bit in front of them and you hit the leading shot and take them out. So, but, what I liked in that was, much like in the Assassin's Creed games, is quite often you can just decide that you just want to get into a big fight and you just want to fight a bunch of enemies all at once. And you just have to just like move around and do all those bits and pieces. And sometimes it's good just to cause a bit of chaos. So that's what I really enjoyed about that. And, as you're moving through these spaces, little, quests will pop up, sort of like radiant quests that'll appear, and you're like, there'll be a freighter, for example, that's taking damage from pirates. So you can run in there and go and fight them off and get a little bit of extra rep for one of the crews, or you might just get a bit of extra credits or pick up some cargo or something like that. It'll increase your ship's abilities and things like that. So, for that for me, I found was quite fun because it's, every time you jump to a planet, there's at least another environment to experience before you go off into that new area as well. And there's quite a few quests that you will pick up on the surface of the planet, and then it'll send you off into space because you've got to go collect something or find something else. And then they're kind of like little breadcrumbs of those quests kind of jumping through different parts of the world. So, that's what I really liked about it. It may be, as you said, not as fleshed out as some of the other aspects of this particular game, but, in terms of like just fun, I found it fun. I found it really fun to just like blast a bunch of spaceships. So.
And I think that the good thing there is that you have the choice. There are some quests and some missions where you are prompted to take to space and take on a bunch of TIE fighters or pirates or whoever it may be. But overwhelmingly, you can choose to engage with it as much or as little as is necessary. And I think for me, while the space combat wasn't my favorite part of Outlaws, I did appreciate the fact that if I just wanted to get from point A to point B, I could do so rather quickly. But as you've mentioned, if you want to go and shoot up a bunch of enemy spaceships or find hidden cargo or that sort of stuff, that's there for you to engage with, and that's there for you to take on, which I think is really good. And it's something I appreciate about Outlaws because I'll admit, after years of playing open world AAA games that follow a lot of the similar conventions and tropes and structures, I'm quite fatigued on open world games as a whole. So I really like with Star Wars Outlaws. Yes, there are parts where you have to engage with some of the sprawling land area or space area, as it were, to fulfill some of the quests, but by and large, you can just focus on the densely populated areas to uncover the story, focus on the really core quest and mission sort of lines, which I think is a great way to do about it. It's a game that there is plenty of scale if you want to take in and absorb all of it, but it does, as we said at the start of the discussion, that it handles scale and scope really, really well, that you can just focus on the really narrow focus, the really populated, the really well the well polished areas of this game, which is what I've focused on. But it's great that there's the choice to do so, and both are equally valid approaches.
It's interesting. I think it's almost like, as you said there, like you could just like mainline the main quest areas and just work your way through that as well. And that'd be a perfectly enjoyable game, even if it didn't have any of the open world, if it didn't have any of the space combat, if it didn't have all those sort of radiant quests where you could go and do all those bits and pieces. So those like set piece levels are really enjoyable. Play on all the different factions and things like that, which is really nice. But then you've kind of got all this stuff that you can explore if you want. So I think this is going to be a game that, will offer quite a lot for a lot of different people.
Yeah, and I I certainly haven't mainlined the main quest or the main game, because I have spent probably more time than I'd care to admit in the Sabak parlors. So for those who enjoy,
you're going to be owing the huts all that money.
yeah. But I've been winning more often than not. So for those who enjoy
That's
playing,
that's what they all say.
Yeah. Well, in the starting planet on Tashara, there is someone outside of one of the gambling parlors, or I think it might be the racing sort of things. The Star Wars equivalent of the tab, where you can. There's this fella who's like, oh, just give me a few credits. I've lost all my credits, but I'm all just around the corner from winning it all back, and you can choose to give them money or not. But that's perhaps my approach with Sabak, the in-game, very very famous Star Wars card game, which is a lot of fun to play. So there are plenty of really good distractions, as well as the arcade machines as well, which I've spent a bit of time with as well.
Yeah, it's really good. I really like all those little elements that just kind of feel really nicely ingrained in the world. Yeah, the Fathia races, which are basically like space horses or whatever, which are introduced in one of the sequel ones. So you can you don't have to play it fair as well, which is kind of cool. Like you can get a hint and what the next race will be from a bunch of data pads that are kicking around in the world, or you can get loaded dice for Sabak as well, which is kind of cool as an upgrade path. And you find those elements by completing quests as well. So it gives you lots of opportunity. There's lots of really lovely and interesting like cameos and little world building elements as well for people who love the games. Like when I hit Tatooine, for example, there's a bunch of moisture farms in the first area where you land. And I was like, I wonder if you can go find, the Lars homestead where Luke grew up. And of course you can. Yes, you can. And there's little interesting story elements that are part of that. And you can kind of see the remnants of what has happened in the game. So you kind of always feel like in many circumstances, you're kind of just walking slightly about 3 steps behind a lot of the film characters, which is kind of cool. Those big major players that you look forward to seeing in those films, they're just kind of crossing into the world in a way that doesn't feel like, oh yeah, here's Chewbacca. You remember him from the Star Wars movies? So that's kind of cool. I really enjoy all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, they've done so in a very I think well measured and tasteful way as well, in terms of, as you say, it's not just a theme park ride of here's all the best hits of Star Wars or here's all the familiar faces. The cameos and the characters that they have included in this game who aren't new for Outlaws, like KVS, I think have been really well integrated and really well chosen. There's one character in particular who is part of one of the main quest lines on Kijimi, which Kijimi itself is a planet that featured very, as a very quick little blink and you miss it sort of thing in Rise of the Skywalker. But the character included was one that was introduced as part of some of the spin-off films, and I think their inclusion as a really, really good one, and one that made sense for the story, and also fleshed out that character a little bit more, which unfortunately we haven't got to see much of them in terms of some of the mainline Star Wars franchise. So I thought it was really good that they sort of got some time to shine and really fleshed out the world even more as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because I think, where it's set in the sequence of the Star Wars films, the Empire's still large, but, there's all these criminal elements that are rolling around, and you just get to feel like, you're in the world in a way that hasn't been done as well before. I think there will be people who play this game and go, this is still a bit of a laundry list. There's all those sorts of things, but it's very easy as well to just go, all right, I'm going to concentrate on doing the bits and pieces that I need to do, and maybe take very slight detours in much like a Breath of the Wild, right? You can that's kind of really what reminds me of this, because you're you're kind of heading in a direction and then you just get slightly pulled to the side. And then it's only brief, and then you're back on the path again. And that's what I think is, that era of game design has really kind of come to the fore now. We had a few early examples where they were trying that sort of thing out, but now it's really clear that this is a design convention that's going to stay, and this is a really good example of using that particular way of designing games and applying it to a Star Wars format, which works really, really nicely.
Yeah, so with that all considered, do you drop or rate Star Wars Outlaws?
I rate it, definitely. I kind of want to go back and play some more right now, actually. I'm really enjoying the world. It's super fun to experience. Kay is actually a really compelling character. I actually was worried because quite often these characters can be a bit annoying, to be honest, if they're not the main characters, right? You're just like, oh, why do I care about this person? But Kay's really enjoyable. Nix is great. Kay's relationships with all the other cartels and the other characters in your crew, all that sort of stuff is really fun. And it feels really nice to visit this world and to genuinely walk into the places that I had in my head, in my imagination since being a kid, and being able to walk down the main street of Mos Eisley and see all this teeming life and see stormtroopers on dewbacks walking down the main road and then walk into the cantina where it all happens, and all of that sort of stuff is really, really cool. So I really enjoy it. It's definitely one that I think if people play it over towards the end of the year or all that sort of time when people have got time off, I think you'll get a lot of fun out of it and have heaps to enjoy out of Star Wars Outlaws.
I agree, and I also really highly rate Star Wars Outlaws. I think it does a lot of things really, really well in terms of a lot of those AAA conventions. It sort of uses the best of a lot of the big budget games that we've got without bordering too much into the unnecessary bloat of a lot of open world games. It has a really great focus, and it just feels like Star Wars. It feels so authentic. It feels so lived in, and it's just a joy to spend time in and explore. It's just so great, and I agree. I love Kay, but I love Nix even more. Love me a cute little fluffy companion, and Nix is one of the best.
Join the SIFTER community on Discord at sifter.com.au/Discord.
That is Star Wars Outlaws. So thank you very much to Ubisoft Australia for providing us with review access to the game. This has been Drop Rate by SIFTER, our video game review podcast. Thanks to Brian Fairbanks from Salty Dog Sounds for composing the theme music. And SIFTER is produced by Chris Button, Courtney Smith, Kyle Pauletto, Fiona Bartholomaeus, and Adam Christou. Mitch Lowe is senior producer, and Gianni Di Giovanni is executive producer. That's all for this week. Follow SIFTER on TikTok to keep up with the biggest stories in video games, and visit sifter.com.au for written coverage, and you can find us on all the socials at SIFTER HQ. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next time.